Imagine stepping out of your house on a calm sunny morning, coffee in hand, ready to start the day only to find rows of razor-sharp spikes glistening like a trap from a nightmare stretched across your own driveway. That's exactly what I saw. My yellow sports car, parked just inches away, was seconds from having its tires shredded into nothing, and standing across the street, pretending to water their plants like they were innocent angels, were the Karen sisters, two of the most entitled, vengeful neighbors anyone could ever be cursed with. This wasn't the first time they'd pulled a stunt like this. For months they had been at war with me over the simplest things: where I parked my car, how green my lawn was, even the fact that I received more packages than they did. Their jealousy and obsession had turned into open hostility. At first it was small trash tossed onto my yard, mail going missing, and endless nasty comments. But today, the stakes were higher. They had escalated from petty acts to something truly dangerous. My driveway had been turned into a weapon. A weapon meant not just to destroy property, but to send a clear message. We controlled this neighborhood. They thought I'd back down, sell my house, or live in fear. But they were wrong. This was the breaking point. And when the law got involved, the Karen sisters would finally learn that their entitlement could carry real consequences. What started as a bitter neighbor feud was about to explode into something far more serious, and this time, it would cost them everything. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had found the perfect place to live. The street was quiet, the lawns were neat, and the houses looked like they had been lifted straight from a postcard. Children rode their bikes in the evenings. Older couples strolled together under the shade of the trees, and every morning neighbors waved politely as they headed off to work. It felt safe. It felt calm. I thought I had found my sanctuary. After years of living in cramped apartments and noisy city blocks, but peace doesn't last long when envy takes root. It started on a warm Saturday afternoon when I parked my car, just a plain sedan back then, near the curb, outside the house of two sisters who lived next door. They were in their late 40s, both unmarried, always together, and known by everyone in the area for their sharp tongues. People whispered about them often, though never loud enough for the sisters to hear. They were called the Karens behind their backs, a nickname that spread because of their constant complaints, and the way they seemed to believe the entire neighborhood belonged to them. That day, I had been unloading groceries, nothing more. My driveway was crowded with boxes I had yet to unpack from moving in, so I pulled up near their property to save myself a little trouble. 10 minutes, that was all it took. 10 minutes before I was standing face to face with the storm that would define my life in this neighborhood. The first sister, taller and sharp-featured, marched out with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed like daggers. "Excuse me," she snapped. "Is this your car?" I nodded, smiling politely, thinking it was nothing. "Yes, just unloading groceries. I'll move it in a minute." Her sister, shorter and heavier but just as fierce, stormed out behind her. "This is private property. You cannot park here. This is our curb." I paused, confused. "I'm sorry, but the street is public. I'll be done in a few minutes." That single sentence lit a fire. Both of them started yelling at once, their voices overlapping like angry birds shrieking at dawn. They accused me of disrespect, of ruining the order of the neighborhood, and even claimed they could call the police. Neighbors peeked out their windows but said nothing. I felt like a spotlight was on me, and the two women were actors in a play they had performed many times before. I didn't argue. I finished unloading quickly, moved the car to my own driveway, and brushed off the incident. In my mind, it was just a misunderstanding, maybe a bad day for them. I couldn't imagine it was the beginning of a war. But over the next weeks I began to notice things, small things at first. My trash bins would mysteriously be tipped over, spilling garbage across the lawn. Mail I had been waiting for would disappear, only to turn up days later, opened and taped shut. Whenever I walked outside, I would feel their eyes on me from behind their curtains, watching, judging. It became clear that they had decided I was their enemy. I tried to stay polite. I greeted them whenever I saw them, though my good mornings were met with cold silence. I made sure never to park near their house again. But their hatred didn't fade. If anything, it grew. The final spark came when I bought a new car. It wasn't just any car, it was my dream. A bright yellow sports car, polished to perfection, the kind of vehicle that makes children's faces light up and strangers turn their heads as you drive past. I had saved for years to afford it, and when I pulled into my driveway for the first time with the engine humming, I felt proud. But pride has a way of drawing jealousy, and jealousy, when fed, becomes poison. From that day on, the sisters' hostility turned vicious. Whenever I washed my car, they stood on their porch, whispering to each other with sneers on their faces. If neighbors stopped by to admire it, the sisters would shout comments like, "Some people waste money to show off," or "That thing doesn't belong in this neighborhood." At night, I began finding small scratches along the paint, almost invisible in the dark but glaring in daylight. Once, I discovered sugar poured around the fuel cap, an attempt to ruin the engine. It wasn't just the car. They called the homeowners association repeatedly, complaining that my lawn wasn't cut short enough, that my trash cans stayed out too long, that my music played softly indoors was disturbing. Each time the HOA sighed, knowing the complaints were baseless. But still, The constant harassment wore on me that the worst part was the silence of the neighborhood. Everyone knew what the sisters were like, but nobody wanted to be on their bad side. That Karens had lived there for decades, and their reign of entitlement had scared people into submission. If I fought back too hard, I would be standing alone. I told myself I could endure it, that they would eventually get bored and move on. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. People like them didn't stop. They escalated, and I could feel it, like the air before a storm. Something was coming, and I was right. Because one morning, months after the first argument, I stepped out of my house with a cup of coffee, ready to drive to work, and froze in my tracks. There, stretched across my driveway like a bed of steel fangs, were rows upon rows of deadly sharp spike strips. They glistened in the sun, cruel and menacing. My heart slammed against my chest. My car, my dream car, sat inches away from ruin. And across the street, on their porch, the sisters stood with their watering cans, pretending to tend to their flowers. But I saw the smirks on their faces. They thought they had finally won. That what they didn't know was that I wasn't the same neighbor who had backed down months ago. I had been watching, I had been preparing, and this time, the battle had only just begun. The morning I found those spike strips laid out across my driveway, I stood frozen for several seconds, unable to process the sight in front of me. It didn't feel real at first. The sun was shining, the air was fresh, and birds were chirping, yet there, in the middle of my suburban driveway, sat a weapon, cold, metallic, and cruel. The rows of sharp steel teeth glistened like something out of a military checkpoint. Not a quiet neighborhood street. My first instinct was shock. My second was anger. Whoever had put them there had crossed a line. This wasn't petty revenge, like scratching paint or tossing trash. This was deliberate sabotage, dangerous and costly. If I had reversed out without noticing, my tires would have been shredded instantly, possibly even causing me to lose control. Worse, if a child had come running down the driveway, they could have been seriously hurt. I didn't need to guess who was responsible. Across the street, the Karen sisters stood on their porch, one holding a watering can, the other clutching her coffee mug. Their eyes flicked toward me and my car, then back to each other. They were trying to look casual, but the corners of their mouths curled upward. They didn't have to say a word. Their satisfaction gave them away. For a moment, I considered storming across the street, demanding answers, unleashing the fury that had been building in me for months. But I stopped myself. That was what they wanted, to see me lose control, to twist the story until I was the aggressor. No, I needed to be smarter, so I pulled out my phone, snapped photos of the spikes from different angles, and then slowly removed them one by one, setting them in a neat pile beside the driveway. The whole time, I kept my head high, refusing to give the sisters the satisfaction of seeing me panic. If they wanted a reaction, they wouldn't get it, not yet. Still, my hands trembled as I worked. Every scrape of metal against the pavement sent a chill down my spine. I could feel their eyes on me, drinking in every second of the scene like vultures circling a wounded animal. That night, I barely slept. I replayed the events in my head, over and over, wondering how far they would go. What was next? Would they damage the brakes on my car, poison my dog if I ever got one, break into my home? The thought gnawed at me. Their hatred had no boundaries, and the more I tried to ignore them, the bolder they became. The next morning, I made a decision. I needed evidence. I went online and ordered a set of discrete security cameras, weatherproof, with night vision and motion detection. I spent the weekend installing them around my property, carefully angling them to capture the driveway, front yard, and the edges of the street. I even placed one above my garage, pointed directly at the spot where I usually parked my car. If the sisters tried something again, I would have proof. Days passed quietly at first, too quietly. The Karens seemed to retreat into the background, going about their routines without their usual glares or insults. I almost wondered if they had realized they'd gone too far with the spikes. But deep down, I knew better. This was not peace, it was the calm before the storm. Sure enough, one night just past midnight, I was woken by the faint sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. My heart pounded as I crept to the window and peered out through the blinds. There, under the pale glow of the street lamp, I saw them, both sisters, hunched over near my driveway, carrying something long and heavy between them. I didn't run outside. Instead, I grabbed my phone and opened the camera app connected to the security system. The screen lit up with a live feed, crystal clear, and there it was. The sisters, caught red-handed, dragging another set of spike strips toward my driveway. My hands shook as I hit record. Finally, dash-proof. I watched them struggle to lay the strips down, whispering furiously at each other, their faces twisted with determination. When they were satisfied, they hurried back across the street, disappearing into the shadows of their porch. I sat back, breathing heavily, my anger mixing with relief. The evidence was mine now. The next morning, I didn't remove the spikes immediately. Instead, I left them there, untouched, as I went about my morning routine. I wanted the sisters to see me walking past casually, sipping my coffee, pretending nothing was wrong. Their curtains twitched with curiosity, and I imagined them whispering, wondering why I wasn't reacting. After finishing breakfast, I calmly loaded the footage onto a USB drive and made copies on my computer. Then I called the police. When the officers arrived, they took one look at the spikes and frowned. "That's serious," one of them said, crouching down to inspect the metal teeth. "Could cause a lot of damage." I handed them the footage without a word. They watched silently, their expressions hardening with every passing second. By the time the recording ended, there was no doubt left. The sisters weren't just troublesome neighbors, they were criminals. The officers crossed the street and knocked on their door. I stayed back, watching from my porch as the confrontation unfolded. At first, the sisters denied everything, their voices sharp and defensive. But when the officers showed them the footage, their confidence shattered. Their faces drained of color, and their excuses faltered. It was the first time I had ever seen them truly speechless. The officers didn't arrest them that morning, but they issued a strong warning. Charges could be filed if this behavior continued, and the sisters were told in no uncertain terms that they were under close watch. The look of humiliation on their faces as the officers left was almost satisfying enough, but I knew this wasn't the end. People like them didn't back down. They doubled down. Sure enough, later that evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the houses in gold, I heard shouting outside. One of the sisters was standing on her porch, pointing at me, yelling about how I had set them up and how outsiders don't belong in this neighborhood. Her voice carried through the street, drawing the attention of half the block. Her sister chimed in, spewing curses and threats, their rage burning hotter than ever. But this time, I didn't flinch. I simply lifted my phone, pointed it toward them, and pressed record. The message was clear. Every word, every action, every attempt they made to harass me was now being documented. The sisters froze mid-rant, realizing the trap they were in. The balance of power had shifted. For the first time since moving in, I felt a glimmer of control. The night after the police warning, I sat by my window, sipping a cup of coffee and staring across the street at the Karen sisters' darkened house. It was strange, almost too quiet. For months, they had been loud, confrontational, constantly looking for ways to rattle me. But now, after being caught on camera and humiliated in front of the police, they had gone silent. Most people would have taken that as a good sign. Most people would have celebrated the peace, believing that maybe the warning was enough to scare them straight. But I knew better. Silence from people like them was never peace, it was planning. The next morning, when I stepped outside, I found evidence of exactly that. My front lawn was littered with trash, fast food wrappers, broken bottles, even torn-up paper that looked suspiciously like documents from someone's mailbox. At first I thought it was just kids messing around, but then I spotted a familiar detail. One of the wrappers had the name of a local diner written in large, greasy letters. A diner I knew the sisters frequented every weekend. It was their message to me. The war wasn't over. I cleaned the mess in silence, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. But inside, my anger grew heavier, pressing on my chest like a weight. I had the footage. I had the proof. Yet part of me wanted to wait. If they wanted to play games, I would let them dig their hole deeper. That evening, as the sun set and the neighborhood settled into quiet routines, I checked my cameras again, and sure enough, just past midnight, there they were creeping across my lawn like shadows, dressed in dark hoodies, their faces partially covered. One of them carried a bucket, the other held a large bag. I zoomed in, my stomach twisting as I realized what they were doing. They poured the bucket along the edge of my driveway, a thick, sticky liquid that glistened under the moonlight. The second sister pulled objects from the bag, broken glass, rusty nails, sharp pieces of metal, and scattered them across the wet surface like confetti. They were trying to turn my driveway into a minefield, making sure that even if I avoided spike strips, I'd still be trapped. My hands clenched into fists as I watched. This wasn't petty anymore. This was dangerous. The next day, I showed the footage to the police again. The officer I spoke with shook his head, clearly frustrated. "These women don't know when to quit," he muttered. "We'll add this to the report. At this point, charges are very likely. Keep recording everything. Don't confront them. We'll handle it." But handling it wasn't fast enough for me. I was tired of feeling like a prisoner in my own home. I wanted my peace back. I wanted my life back. Over the following days, the sisters escalated further. They began shouting insults at me whenever I stepped outside, their words loud enough for the entire block to hear. "Shove, trash, you don't belong here." The neighborhood grew tense. I could feel my other neighbors shrinking into their homes, avoiding the drama. Nobody wanted to take a side, even though everyone knew who the villains were. Then came the night of the firecrackers. I was lying in bed around 2 a.m. when a series of loud pops jolted me awake. At first I thought it was gunfire, but then I saw the flashes outside my window. Firecrackers, dozens of them, had been thrown into my yard, exploding near my car, leaving scorch marks on the driveway. I rushed outside with a fire extinguisher, heart pounding, terrified that sparks might catch on the grass or worse, the car. Across the street, the sisters stood in the shadows of their porch laughing, not even trying to hide this time. That was the breaking point for me. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my living room, lights dimmed, scrolling through the hours of footage I had collected. Spike strips, trash, broken glass, midnight sabotage. firecrackers. It was more than enough for the police. It was more than enough for a lawyer. And it was certainly more than enough for the court. The next morning, I marched into the police station with a folder full of evidence. The officer on duty recognized me immediately. This time, there was no hesitation. Reports were filed, and the case was escalated. By the afternoon, detectives were reviewing the footage. The sisters must have sensed what was coming, because later that evening they tried one last act of intimidation. I had just finished dinner when I heard a knock on my door. I checked the peephole and froze. It was them. Both sisters, standing side by side, their faces twisted in smug smiles. For a moment, I considered ignoring them, but something inside me told me to open the door. Not to engage, but to hear what they had to say. I cracked it open, keeping the chain locked. "You think you're smart," the taller one hissed. "You think you can run us out of our own neighborhood. This isn't over," her sister added, her voice low and venomous. "You don't know who you're messing with." I didn't respond. I simply held up my phone, recording every second. Their expressions shifted when they realized I was filming, but they didn't back down. They just sneered, spat a few more curses, and stormed back across the street. That was their final mistake. The next day, officers returned not just to warn but to act. Warrants were issued. Charges were filed. Vandalism, harassment, trespassing, reckless endangerment, the list went on. The sisters screamed as they were handcuffed on their porch, their shrill voices echoing through the neighborhood. Curtains twitched, doors opened, and for the first time my neighbors stepped outside, watching as the reign of the Karen sisters crumbled. I stood on my lawn, silent, watching as they were led away. Their eyes met mine, full of hatred, but also something else, fear. For the first time since I moved in, I felt safe. Not just safe indicated, but even as the police cars disappeared down the street, a thought lingered in the back of my mind. What if prison wasn't enough to stop them? What if, somehow, they found their way back? The war wasn't over. Not yet. The day of the first court hearing arrived, with a tension that felt heavy enough to choke the air. I had woken up early, unable to sleep, pacing back and forth in my living room as the minutes dragged by. Even though I knew the evidence was stacked against the Karen sisters' hours of footage. Police reports, eyewitness statements, I still felt a gnawing unease. These women had made my life miserable for months. What if they somehow managed to twist the narrative and convince a judge that I was the problem? Walking into the courthouse, I could feel eyes on me. A few of my neighbors had come, curious to see the drama play out in person. They didn't speak to me, not yet, but their faces told me enough. They were tired of the sisters, but too afraid to ever stand against them until now. The sisters entered next, escorted by their lawyer. They looked different than I had ever seen them, dressed in plain suits, their hair neat, their expressions carefully crafted into masks of innocence. But their eyes gave them away. When they glanced at me, I saw the same venom, the same seething anger that had driven them to sabotage my car, my driveway, and my peace. The proceedings began with the charges being read: allowed vandalism, trespassing, harassment, reckless endangerment. Each word felt like a stone being laid on a growing pile, and I could see the sisters shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Their lawyers stood tall, confident, ready to battle. When it was their turn to respond, the lies came quickly. They claimed they were being framed, that I had staged the evidence to ruin their reputations. They painted me as an outsider who had never fit into the neighborhood, someone who had always wanted to cause trouble. Their lawyer tried to spin the narrative into a story of two women being bullied by a vindictive neighbor, but then my attorney stood and presented the footage. The courtroom grew silent as the videos played on the large screen. There they were, the sisters, caught in the glow of street lamps, dragging spike strips across my driveway. There they were, scattering broken glass, tossing trash, lighting firecrackers. And there they were again, standing on my porch, threatening me in their own words. Every frame dismantled their defense, piece by piece. The murmurs started almost immediately. Neighbors whispered in the gallery, shaking their heads, some even laughing at the absurdity of the sisters' denials. For once, the entire community could see the truth without distortion. The sisters weren't victims, they were aggressors, bullies who had finally gone too far. The taller sister lost control first. She stood abruptly, pointing at me across the courtroom, her face red with rage. "He set us up. He's been against us since the day he moved in. None of this is real." The judge banged the gavel sharply. "To sit down or you will be removed from this courtroom." Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, trying to pull her back into a chair, but the damage was already done. Her outburst had destroyed the fragile image of innocence she had tried to maintain. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't launch into a long speech. I simply told the truth. I described how I had moved into the neighborhood, how the first confrontation had started over a parking spot, and how things had spiraled since then. I explained how I had tried to ignore them, how I had only installed cameras to protect myself, and how every act of harassment had been documented, not provoked. I ended with a simple statement: "I just want to live in peace." The judge studied me for a long moment, then turned back to the sisters. Their lawyer attempted to salvage the case, but it was clear the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The trial moved quickly after that. By the end of the day, The judge announced the decision. The sisters would be charged with multiple counts of vandalism, harassment, and trespassing. Sentencing would come later, but the outcome was clear: they were guilty. The sound that followed wasn't just relief. It was release. I could feel the room exhale all at once, like the neighborhood itself had been holding its breath for months. For the first time, people approached me. One neighbor patted me on the shoulder, whispering, "Thank you. You did what none of us could." Another shook my hand, his eyes full of gratitude. But not everyone was relieved. The sisters screamed as officers approached to escort them out. They shouted curses, threats, wild accusations. One of them yelled, "This isn't over. We'll get you back." Their voices echoed down the hallway, shrill and desperate, until the doors closed behind them. I stood there, numb, listening to the silence they left behind. That night, I returned home to find small clusters of neighbors waiting. People who had once avoided me now smiled, waved, even came up to talk. They apologized for not stepping in sooner, explained how the sisters had tormented them for years, and admitted they had been too afraid to stand up. "You showed us it's possible to fight back," one woman said, her voice soft but full of conviction. I wanted to feel triumphant. I wanted to believe it was over, but deep down, I couldn't shake the sisters' final words. "This isn't over." As I locked my door that night and turned on the porch lights, I found myself staring across the street at their dark, empty house. For the first time since moving in, the windows didn't have eyes behind them. The porch didn't hold their judgmental stares. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like a pause, like the eye of a hurricane, because even with them gone, a part of me knew their shadows still lingered. And shadows, no matter how far they're pushed back, always find a way to return. The weeks following the courtroom drama felt strangely quiet, almost unnaturally so. For the first time since I had moved into the neighborhood, I could walk outside without feeling eyes burning holes through me from across the street. The Karen sisters' house stood dark, their porch empty, their curtains drawn. Without their constant presence, the entire street felt lighter, as though a heavy shadow had finally lifted. But the quiet also carried an edge of uncertainty. The sisters had been sentenced to time behind bars shorter than I would have liked, but long enough to remove them from the neighborhood for the foreseeable future. They also faced fines for the damages they had caused, along with strict orders to stay away from me and my property once they were released. On paper, it was justice. In reality, it felt like a fragile shield. These were women who thrived on spite, who saw every setback as fuel for vengeance. A piece of paper wouldn't stop them if they returned. Despite the unease, I tried to move forward. I fixed my lawn, repainted the scratches on my car, and washed away the stains left from their sabotage. Each repair was a small act of reclaiming my space. Neighbors began stopping by more often, some offering to help, others just wanting to talk. They admitted that the sisters had terrorized the community for years, and many confessed they had once considered moving away because of them. "Stood your ground," one neighbor told me as we chatted on the sidewalk. "You didn't just save yourself. You saved all of us." For the first time, I realized that this battle hadn't been mine alone. I had carried the burden, but everyone had been living under the sisters' reign of entitlement. Their downfall had freed the entire street. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. At night, when the wind rustled through the trees, I sometimes imagined it was their voices, whispering threats. When headlights swept across my driveway, my chest tightened, half expecting to see them standing there with their smug smiles and venomous words. Trauma doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers like smoke after a fire. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk past their house. It was strange seeing it abandoned. Weeds had already begun to grow along the edges of the lawn. The paint on the shutters was peeling, and the once pristine porch now looked tired and worn. Without the sisters' obsessive upkeep, the house seemed to be crumbling under the weight of its own silence. It reminded me of them, so focused on control, yet hollow inside. The neighborhood began to thrive again in their absence. Families hosted barbecues without fear of complaints. Kids rode their bikes freely, no longer yelled at for touching the wrong part of the sidewalk. Even the HOA, once plagued by endless reports from the sisters, felt like it had been reborn. Meetings were calm, decisions were made without drama, and for once, the community felt united. As the weeks turned into months, I allowed myself to finally breathe. I had learned a hard lesson. Standing up to bullies comes with a price, but silence costs even more. If I had ignored their harassment, if I had allowed their entitlement to go unchecked, things might have spiraled further into danger. Instead, I chose to fight back, not with fists or rage, but with patience, evidence, and truth. And that choice had changed everything. The final moment of closure came when I received a letter from the court. It confirmed the sisters' sentence, the fines they owed, and the restraining order that would remain in place long after their release. Holding that letter in my hands felt like holding the final chapter of a long, exhausting book. That night, I stood on my porch looking at my driveway. The memory of spike strips, broken glass, and firecrackers flashed in my mind, but they no longer carried the same weight. Instead of fear, I felt gratitude that I had endured, that justice had been served, and that peace had returned. The war was over. I knew life would never be the same. The scars were there on my car, on my lawn, and inside me, but scars are proof of survival. And survival, in the end, was victory. As I locked the door and turned off the porch light, I whispered to myself, it's finally done. And for the first time, I truly believed it.